and guest present this evening. Welcome to our very first technical presentation today. My name is Akeem Makunju. I am the chair of the CIBSE Southwest County region. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, David Mooney, who is a principal lighting engineer and is also a lead at the Atkins Specialist Architectural Lighting Group. David is also a fellow of Light and Lighting Society and also a member of the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineer. David is also a member of the Illuminating Engineering Society North American, and he will be delivering today designing emergency lighting using the RIBA plan of works. Without further ado, I would like to hand you over to David now, who will take us through the presentation. Many thanks.
Thank you, Hakeeb. So the purpose of this presentation is to think about how we design emergency lighting and what the information we need at the various stages through the project, rather than looking at what we actually design it. The information flow is very critical for emergency lighting. I will do a brief introduction about what emergency lighting requirements are, but this is really about design management and making sure that you get the information for various types of projects at the right time. And I'm using the RIBA plan of work as a framework to describe the timeline of the projects. Okay. An emergency lighting system is a life safety system. There is no reason to compromise on the prime objective of providing safe lighting to exit a building in the case of a power failure, whether it be partial or complete. It is important to think that when you do an emergency lighting system, that you are competent to do that design. And you may well be competent to do some designs, but not others. And I will come on, competency is a big thing at the moment, and it will become even more bigger when the new building regulation framework comes into place. So I would ask you all to think, whenever you do an emergency lighting scheme, whether you are competent to design that scheme or install it or maintain it. This is a big statement. Emergency lighting is not difficult. 90% of the emergency lighting schemes that go into Britain are simple. They will be able to be done with a self-contained fitting with an integral battery pack on it that delivers the emergency lighting for the areas there. You'll be able to use BS 5266 as your main design framework, and you'll be able to deliver it. That part is not hard. What is more hard is making sure that the other members of the design team provide the information that you require. Okay, so emergency lighting is divided up into 3 types of emergency lighting. Emergency escape lighting, which is what everyone normally recognizes as escape routes, areas over 60 meters, and covering the escape routes through to the place of safety. Emergency safety lighting is additional lighting that is provided if people are required not to evacuate immediately. And there may well be cases where you might have an airport where there are security concerns. Often going from an airport, escaping or going out the escape route is more unsafe than actually staying where you are. So there will be a detailed fire strategy that tells you what you do. But BS 5266 says that you should provide emergency safety lighting when you are not escaping immediately, or when there is a time that is that people are held in areas at the time there. And it may be something like a care home, maybe a hospital or whatever, but it is where you are not immediately escaping. Standby lighting is where you are required to carry on duties that require normal lighting conditions during a power failure. So that might be a control room, it might be a fire center there, but you are doing normal tasks during an outage. So that is very difficult to quantify and will nearly always require additional information from the client. So when you actually look at this, there are certain areas of lighting which are statutory, and there are certain areas of lighting which are not statutory, particularly on there. So escape lighting is statutory. You are required to provide that under Part B of the building regulations to light the way through to the place of safety. And that includes the escape routes, high risk areas, anti-panic and points of emphasis. And if you've done emergency lighting before, you should be all very much aware of those particular concepts and what that actually means. Safety lighting, as we said, is for it there and may well be statutory as part of the risk assessment that is signed off by the client in there. So it becomes part of the area there. Standby lighting, not really statutory at all. You can do what you want, but you should obviously think about that, and it should be covered by a risk assessment to make sure that you're giving the right sort of lighting to the people there based on their occupancy and their tasks. So I hope everyone is familiar with this. This is the RIBA plan of works, and this tells you the core tasks, mostly from an architectural point of view, but when it's supplemented with the BSRIA BG6 document, it tells you your services requirements all the way through there. And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to use these stages to actually think about the information we require at different stages of the project. So when you start a project, you're probably required to provide a fee, and you're going to need a lot of information as to what the project actually is. If it is an existing building, there will be that information will be available. How are you going to build the fee? What are the things that you need to be able to do? So at stage one, this is making sure that you understand the project and you have all the information available to you to be able to carry out the project properly there. And you may well require other information from other people, even at this stage. Certainly, you are going to need to know who is the responsible person for the building, and you're going to have to ask them for information about their building and what it is that they're trying to do. What is this building for? How is it going to be used? Just big questions. You won't necessarily get all the answers at this stage, but you should have a feel for what the type of job you're actually doing at this stage. You can't really price a job. You can't make sure about program or anything if you don't have that basic part of information. So at concept design, you're really putting down on paper the basic principles of the emergency lighting system. Unlikely that you will do drawings at this stage, but certainly you should be having conversations with the client as to what type of emergency lighting they would like, particularly, and what it is that they are trying to do. If it's as simple as a scout hut or a church hall, it may well the self-contained emergency lighting only fittings may well be suitable. Where are the signs going to go? Is there a fire strategy? Where are the escape routes? These are the things that you start to need to know to do this. So the key thing that you need to do at this stage is form a basis of design, which you're going to do, issue it to the client, and make sure the client understands what it is that you're going to do for them and how that your design is going to meet their requirements. Key in this is requesting an initial client risk assessment, right? You won't get the answers to this, but if you ask for it at stage 2, then it won't become as a shock to the client just as you're going out to tender and say, well, I haven't got one. And I don't know what all the additional high risk areas are. All the project requirements should be identified in that. So you might have a framework of this. This needs to be provided by the client. The designer should not be writing the risk assessment. You do not know enough information about the way that the client is going to use the building to write the risk assessment. They have to take that on board. It is their document and it becomes a legal document at the end of the project. So let's have a look at the deliverables. We've talked about the basis of design. We should know initially the escape routes. How are you going to get out of the building? Where is the place of safety? If it's a campus project, there may well need to be external lighting provided from the building to the place of safety, which is normally the muster point. So you need to think about that. If it's a refurbishment building, you need actually to request all the as-fitted information on that. And BS 5266 says that you should actually do a survey of the building and see whether it meets the standard, and say to the client, if there are shortfalls, how are you dealing with these shortfalls? Because if you are, say, required to actually just refit out a room or a floor in a building, that is not the emergency lighting for the building. The certificate is for the whole building. So therefore your design has to work with the whole, and you need to know what the whole actually is there. And that's very important. A lot of people don't pick up on that there. So you should also do a duration test, an annual duration test of the emergency lighting, existing emergency lighting, to see that it's working and report on it. So it's a survey and a report, and then put that out there, and that will then tell the client of any additional things that they may need to do in your contract, or they may need to get someone else in to deal with those shortfalls so that your contract and your design works for the whole of the building. Right, so fire strategy. There may be a fire strategy, but in small buildings there may not. It may be that the architect is the fire engineer and he's just going to provide things there. But if you're talking about a fire engineered building, you need to talk to the fire engineer and understand what the fire strategy actually is and how your emergency lighting works alongside it. Remember, emergency lighting is not only for fire, it's for any power outage, partial or complete. So the emergency lighting is not necessarily a fire system. It can deal with a power outage which is caused by fire, but it has got to deal with the loss of power there. That's what it's there for. Detailed options for emergency lighting systems can make cases for that. So you need to have your early talk with the client to understand what the best option for your project is. And this will depend on the size of the project, the complexity of the project, and the level of size in terms of things, whether you've got space for a power system, a central power system or distributed central battery system, you may not have space for it, so you may have to go self-contained. But the cutoff point generally is around 120 to 120 to 140 luminaires self-contained before central power systems start to become viable in a whole life costing scenario. There may well be other reasons for putting in self-contained or distributed central battery systems, but those central power systems or things there require additional accommodation, which you then got to think about. What's the cost of a space in a plant room or in the basement? There, the BS 5266 says you should not put your emergency lighting in the switch room with the electrical feed, and you can think why that should be the case. If there was a fire in the switchboard, you'd also take out the central battery system as well. So it should be in a separate space, fire protected space, away from the switchboard. Request the responsible person for the initial emergency lighting risk assessment. That is absolutely key, because when you start to do this, you will then start to be able to address additional emergency lighting requirements, which are project specific beyond the table that is in for high risk lighting in the areas there. An emergency lighting and risk assessment may actually say that you don't need emergency lighting in certain areas there, and you could use it borrowed light from daylight because the building is only occupied during the day there. So you need to really understand the building and make sure that any departures from the design, the recommended designs that are in 5266 is your way of demonstrating that you have been competent and are designing the correct emergency lighting system for the things. It doesn't cover costs, but it gives you the points that you need to do as a basis, but you may have to do more, you may have to do less. And you need to think about, when you do your declaration of conformity, why you are changing from what the basic requirements of 5266 are. There. So it's key early on to think about what accommodation you require from the architect for the emergency lighting things. So this is what you do in there. If you're doing a central battery system, you need to tell the architect that you need a separate room at this stage, and he will make provisions for it. It's no good coming along later and saying, oh, I've got a central battery system. Where am I going to put the batteries? You need to think about this early in stage 2 and make sure that you have the requisite accommodation. It doesn't need to be a detailed drawing. You can give an estimate of the size of the room that is there. I would suggest that you maybe oversize it by 10 or 15% so that you give some kind of remit, because you may not be choosing the final equipment in the end. That may be a contractor decision, but you make sure that the accommodation is representative and appropriate for the project that you've got. So at this stage, I would also be looking to identify on a marked up drawing which emergency lighting criteria applies to each room. So is it an escape route? Is it an open area, anti-panic area? Is it a high risk area there? And you can put that in, and these are the sorts of images that should be in the end of stage report, and it tells the client, if they're interested, what it is. But if there is a problem later on, you've got an audit trail there that tells you what you were going to do, and you say you've sold people. This is what I'm going to do. Here's the things there. Now the architects will be very interested in what the emergency lighting looks like, where it goes. And they all think that emergency lighting is particularly ugly, nearly always. So you need to have a meeting with the architects and think about what is it going to be appropriate to stick a big luminaire on the wall with a green LED that's showing that it's there, and when you look across and say a darkened space, you can see the green LED with a great big patch of green light on the ceiling. So you have to think about how that's going to look. So there is a requirement to think about the effects of the lighting, emergency lighting, early on. And this should all be picked up in the end of stage report and doing that. Now, what I would say is I'm using the RIBA stage report method here, and this is really appropriate for medium to large projects. Small projects, say under 20 luminaires and signs, really that might not be there. So a lot of these stages may well be condensed into a single stage, and all that information needs to be provided. But the information that you require is no different from a small project to a large project. There will be perhaps more information if there are project specific things, but essentially there is no difference between a small project and a large project in what it is supposed to deliver. So if you have any outstanding items or decisions, I always say list them in the end of stage report so that people know that these things are outstanding and they need to be dealt with at the next stage so that you don't miss them and they don't get forgotten. Right, so RIBA stage 3 is spatial consideration. Right, so this is the last stage in a project where there might well be options on the table. After this, you are working out your lighting calculations, you're doing all the things, and you should have an agreement with the client as to what it is to do. And from a project management point of view, once you get to the end of stage 3 and you sign off, you should be able to charge for changes of mind at that point. So it's important for you commercially as well. Detailed accommodation there, central battery power systems there. You've now detailed that, so you may have an idea as to how big your central battery or central power system is going to be. Health and safety use of emergency lighting. Well, you need to think, are the visually impaired people in here? Are the people that require additional emergency lighting? Again, this is something that needs to be discussed with the client and identified as part of the risk assessment. This time we should be providing an access and maintenance strategy. So if you have there, how are you going to get up and change the luminaires, especially over that staircase that has a double height ceiling above it? No good putting in a self-contained fitting at the top high level there when the battery needs to be changed every 4 years and you need to put a scaffold in to be able to change it in there. That thing, so it may well be better to think about looking at, say, either a remote battery box, putting the batteries in an adjacent ceiling void, or using a central power system. But remember, the emergency lighting maintenance is not just about the luminaire, it's about the batteries and the gear itself as well. So what do I mean by initial emergency lighting level layouts? In BS 5266, you can lay out probably 70% of the luminaires at this stage. So you know your points of emphasis, you know where your exit doors, you know where your escape route is, and you can look at that and provide all the emergency lighting at those points there. And you could, at the end of those points, you're then left with just doing your calculations and finding out how many luminaires you need to fill in between the points of emphasis and the signs and so on. It's there. And remember, you should be giving information to the electrical engineer. So the electrical engineer will need to know what emergency lighting is going in. It may be that there is a lighting designer and an electrical engineer on the jobs, and the electrical engineer, if it's a central power system, will be designing the central power system and the fire rated cabling and the distribution boards, and the lighting designer will just be doing the lighting calculations and positioning the luminaires. So you need to make sure that that information flow works. What is going to be the emergency lighting control and testing strategy? Are you going to have the old style key switches in a space? Is that the way? You can't. BS 5266 says you cannot use the MCBs to test the emergency lighting, so you must provide a method to do it. Are you going to provide a dedicated emergency lighting control system? These are all the things that need to be considered at stage 3. And you can see that I've kept in again the risk assessment. So the risk assessment is a working document and should be getting improved at each stage, and you should have regular meetings to make sure that you're picking up and addressing the points that were in the initial risk assessment and they move through into the final risk assessment. It may be a meeting of an hour, no more than that. It shouldn't be that. You may only need one meeting, but remember that the risk assessment is a working document and needs to work through the design period and then become an as-fitted document that probably needs to be reviewed every year and at any changes in the building format and things there. It may require other things. There may well be a change of use that requires the risk assessment to be reviewed, but it is a live document and should be considered there. So you might, at this time, you should be sending some information to the cost consultant so he knows what the emergency lighting is likely to cost and how you're dealing with it. Most cost consultants will want to put in self-contained because that's what they know, and certainly contractors like that because it's the lowest initial cost. But as I said, when it gets to larger number of luminaires over whole life instances, the central power systems and the distributed central battery systems come into their own and work through the document. So you should also at this stage prepare an outline specification of what the equipment is, and that will help people think about program and the method of procurement that is there. Okay, technical design. This is the business end of a design stage. So here you're doing your emergency lighting calculations, you're choosing your emergency lighting equipment, and you're doing your final design there. And this is what it will go on into the tender documents that the contractor is going to price and the tender will be delivered on. If you're handing over at an early stage and the contractor is the design and build job and the contractor is to develop the design at stage 4, I would suggest you make it very, very clear that you're also handing over design responsibility at that point, and the contractor is now the designer and he needs to be checked by the responsible person to make sure that he is competent, as is in BS 5266, to be able to do an emergency lighting design. So is he a member of BAFE? What qualifications, lighting qualifications, has he got to be able to do a development of the emergency lighting? Fair. If he's using a manufacturer to do the design on his behalf, it is the manufacturer who becomes the designer, and they are taking on design responsibility, and they need to be sure that they are competent to deliver the design as well. So at this stage, you will provide the final luminaire schedule. I'm sorry, it's got a mistake there. That should be final electrical load to the electrical engineer, and all of this is there. So this is where at this stage you should be ready to hand over the job to the things. What are the things that actually you don't know at this stage. And it's common not to know where the fire extinguishers are, where the additional safety signs are, like a first aid point or things like that. So you must ask the architects for that information as early as possible. If they can't provide it, that's fine, and you make sure that you cover these shortfalls in the tender information. You can include a provisional sum or a PC sum for additional emergency lighting. And I would always look to actually include an additional sum of money for the building control officer's whims and wishes at the end of the job, because there may well be changes in the emergency lighting that he requests there, and often they are quite esoteric in what they require, sometimes beyond what BS 5266 says. So this is the things there. Stage 5, you're providing all the information to the contractor to be able to tender the job. Stage 4, manufacture and construction. So if you've now pushed the design onto the contractor to install, it's important to review the tender information provided by the tenders. If they are offering different luminaires to the ones that you specified, and you may well have said, this is the luminaire I want, or equal and approved. If they have come in with an alternative, then your emergency lighting design may well be compromised because the alternatives that they have chosen do not have the spacing to height ratios and the output that is necessary for the job. Each LED fitting is fundamentally different from manufacturer to manufacturer. It is not like the old days of 8-watt fluorescent and 13-watt fluorescent luminaires in a standard brick or round format that allows virtually every luminaire manufacturer to be interchangeable. That is no longer the case. And if they are providing things like conversions of luminaires, you need to see all the conversion papers that have been done by the conversions of a luminaire. And I would suggest to you the better way of doing that is not to convert luminaires and is to provide a separate battery changeover device next to it that runs the luminaire rather than converting the luminaire, because you will not get all the information that you require under BS 60598 2-22, the submittals, the length of the LEDs, all the thermal arrangements from these manufacturers. It becomes difficult to do there. So making a conversion of a luminaire under an LED situation is not to be taken lightly. So we need to review the contractor submittals. We need to attend the coordination meetings. There may well be movements or whatever of the emergency lighting required through additional coordination or changes by the architect or other members of the team that require changes to the emergency lighting. We shouldn't think that these are there. We should look and do regular site inspections to see that the design is moving in the way that we expect. Advise the client on changes that they may be wanting to do in the construction phase. Reviewing the commissioning method statements early is important there. And you need to be sure that the contractor is going to commission the emergency lighting in the right manner. And there are separate commissioning guidance from SLL and CIBSE as what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. And you need to intend the emergency lighting commissioning if you are the responsible designer. I had a project with a client where they had an on-site clerk of works and he attended the meetings, and they wouldn't let the designer attend the meetings. And I said, well, hold on a minute. I'm the designer. You want me to be responsible. I cannot not attend and make sure that my design has gone in. And what was the result of that was we found there were lots of things that had changed during this period. Things like additional defibrillators had gone in. And quite rightly, the clerk of works was asking for an emergency light within 2 meters of a defibrillator. Well, that drawing, that information was found out later in the job, whereas if I'd been able to attend site earlier, then I would have spotted that and understood that that needed to happen. And again, this actually delayed the opening of the building because the building control officer wouldn't sign off the building. So it's really important. This is the business end, and the emergency lighting, all the emergency lighting documents must be in place as you get into RIBA 6. So you must have installers and designers signs off declarations of componentry, fully detailed as fitted drawings, manuals of the emergency lighting, signed off commissioning settings, emergency lighting logbook, and a final signed off emergency lighting risk assessment. So it's very unusual now that for people to be involved in the use of the building. If you will be involved if your client has asked you to do soft landings. So if you're doing soft landings, part of that results should be to actually see that the emergency lighting is being tested properly and see that it is done. Check the control system regularly. Are you getting the reports? Are there any faults? And I believe as a minimum, you should attend the first annual duration test. And this is absolutely part of the final sign off of a job, which will be at the end of the liquidated and ascertained damages period, and should be thought of as being something that needs to be done. And you can be sure, because that, if you are the designer, that's when you are signing off your design fully, and you should be walking away at that point, not when you hand over the building. And lastly, I think it is very, very worthwhile to actually understand the client's risk assessment and see how the building is actually being used, and to attend the first review of the client's risk assessment, and then see that it is going through. And that can be part of your defects liability check as well. So a few conclusions. Agreeing fees, scope, defining the scope, all of that is stage one. Confirming the basis of design, agreeing the system strategy, defining types of equipment, all at stage two. The later you do that, the more problematic it will be. Identification of the final escape routes. It may be that that actually happens under stage two there. But understanding which system you've got, and have you got the space for the central battery systems and the things that you might need? Have you got all the information that you need to now go and spend the majority of the fee in stage 4 to do all the emergency lighting works? Now, one of the questions I was asked at LUX-Live when I presented this personally, what about, the question came from a manufacturer, and he said, well, I only get involved at stage 4. That doesn't stop that you need all the information that I've referred to in stages 1, 2, and 3. You need to be in a position to know what it is you are designing before you start designing. Okay. So traditional contracts, the designer's responsibilities are easy. Design and build can be many types of contract there, but the contractor must be the competent emergency lighting designer. If you're asked to do an initial concept, then you cannot be the competent emergency lighting designer, because you are not making the final decisions on equipment and the nature of the scheme. So the contractor must be that person. Partial design and build, where you do it to a stage, you need to be very careful about how you hand over to the client, to the contractor for there. So we've just had a project recently where we have been novated to the contractor, and the contractor has a company that they wish to use for the emergency lighting. It wasn't the one that we designed upon, and we had to tell the contractor, if you want us to design that, then we've got to redesign and check the design with the new things. Here's our fee for doing it. And that's really very, very important. You can't just change the luminaires immediately. That's our mantra at Atkins. Thanks very much. That's the end of the presentation. Any questions?